In 1991, Street Fighter II was released in the arcades. This game single-handedly shook the gaming industry and popularized a whole new genre of games. At the time, there were numerous conversions that were made to capitalize on the home market. Some were successful and developed by Capcom internally. Others, well, they've seen better days. In this episode, I will explore what an Amiga 1200 home computer conversion could have looked like if the game utilized the hardware effectively. So, stick around and we will be exploring what's happening in the shade of the pixels. Well, as a 10-year-old, I remember sitting in my brother's room drooling over Street Fighter II commercials that aired on MTV. Arcades, well, they weren't that common in the suburbs of Sweden, and the commercials were really the only way I could experience the game as a kid. And I was amazed by the impressive graphics, the huge sprites, and just a badass execution. The commercials taunted about the Super Nintendo version, a platform which I could never really afford at the time. I had just saved up my weekly allowance for 2 whole years and upgraded from an Amiga 500 to an Amiga 1200. And I was just starting to witness the capabilities of that machine, and luckily it seemed, Street Fighter was actually coming to the Amiga. I was so hyped of playing this game, and then I did, but I noticed something was severely off, even as a 10-year-old. I mean, we can laugh about how bad this looks 30 years later, but at the time I actually think there were a lot of people who enjoyed their time with Street Fighter II on the Amiga. But at the same time I also think there were a lot of people who questioned the capabilities of the hardware as well. And to be fair, far from all games ran at a full refresh rate. I remember that I could distinctly tell the difference between games that ran at half refresh rate of 25 frames per second and those that ran at full refresh rate of 50 frames per second. But when it came to Street Fighter II, it was not only that it ran jerkier like half refresh games, it was almost unplayable. One of my friends at the time, he always had the latest gaming hardware, so we played the game at his place on a Super Nintendo, and that's when I realized how bad the Amiga version truly was. I know people tend to categorize these ports as lazy ports, but to be honest, we actually have no idea how well supported the team was back then, what kind of deadline they faced and what kind of budget was made available for the project. Most likely, the developers had no support from Capcom and they had to rip the assets themselves and reverse engineer the code. In the end, they probably tried to the best of their ability to make the game play like what they thought Street Fighter II was. Well, and since about that time, there's always been this technical curiosity growing within me, wanting to know what's technically possible to do on the Amiga, especially the Amiga 1200. Because I always felt like the potential of that machine never really saw the light before Commodore's bankruptcy in 1994. And since the Amiga 500 had such a huge install base back at the time, very few developers worked on games that were exclusive to the new machine. So, one day, I actually decided to recreate a graphical demo of what Street Fighter II could have looked like if it was made for the Amiga 1200 by talented developers that gave the game the time that it deserved. And I came up with this demo. Okay, I know what you guys are thinking. How come this demo looks as good as it does when the original US Gold version looks like this? Well, we really need to dig into the hardware specifications of the Amiga and why Street Fighter II specifically was one of those impossible ports for the format. When you look at arcade hardware, you soon realize that they are very much based around their hardware sprite capabilities. And to put this simple, it's basically hardware accelerated 2D objects that you can throw on screen that can move independently from one another. And there's usually also built-in functionality to the hardware architecture, like collision detection without requiring any CPU performance. Arcade hardware were expensive by design and had a lot of custom chips built into them to handle sprites effectively. Same goes for consoles. Although they didn't have as much sprites, they still had a pretty flexible sprite structure. Usually sprites were divided into 8x8 pixels or 16x16 pixels. These could be interconnected or puzzled together in order to create huge sprites, something that Street Fighter had a lot of. The sprite capabilities of the Amiga, however, was quite different from conventional console hardware or arcade hardware even, since it used sprite strips. What this meant was that the Amiga only had 8 sprites to make use of, and those could be unlimited in height, but on the Amiga 500 they could be 16 pixels wide, and the Amiga 1200 they could be 64 pixels wide. With this kind of setup you can actually make pretty impressive large sprites on the Amiga. However, they weren't that useful because they weren't very flexible and you couldn't puzzle them together in the same sense. And with those 8 sprites, they could only be 4 colors, with one of them being transparent, so really 3 colors. In order to gain 15 colors with one transparency, you needed to connect 2 sprite strips together. And this would mean that you actually only had 4 sprite strips to work with if you were going to make an impressive game like Street Fighter II. Sure, on the Amiga 1200 where you had 64 pixels wide sprite strips, you could actually almost fill the whole screen with sprite data, since 4 times 64 becomes 256 pixels. But in reality, you couldn't use it that way with Street Fighter, and if you look at the Amiga 500, you would only end up with 64 pixels wide sprites. And this really causes a problem, because if we look at Dalsim right here, with his arms all stretched out, he's actually 248 pixels wide, and that's just one character. And this is really where the Amiga falls short. However, does the Amiga have something else that we can use instead of using sprites for the characters? And this is where things become kind of interesting. Sure, the Amiga wasn't constructed like an arcade board. However, it was constructed to be a multimedia computer, and because of this, it had a lot of well thought out custom chips built in. The Amiga 1200 shared a lot of its design from its older brother, the Amiga 500, but it had some significant upgrades in the graphics department. The base color palette of 4096 colors was increased to a full 24-bit color space of 16.8 million colors. And with the ham display mode, the Amiga could theoretically display all of these colors at once, but unfortunately, this display mode was primarily used for still images and was not fast enough or particularly useful for diagonal scrolling arcade games like Street Fighter II. Instead, the Amiga had 2 display modes that were far better optimized for games, the single playfield mode and the dual playfield mode. In single playfield mode, the Amiga 1200 allowed for 256 colors to be displayed at once, which is also quite a substantial leap from the 32 colors of the Amiga 500. Where the Amiga 1200 would see less of an upgrade was in the dual playfield mode. This mode would allow for a lot of neat parallax effects, but the increase from 8 colors per layer to 16 colors per layer was really nothing to write home about. Amiga 500 games that made use of this display mode often came across as somewhat lacking in the color department, which was no surprise. I've done a lot of pixel art conversion, and going from 16 colors to 8 colors usually impacts the visual quality quite heavily. But oddly enough, I actually settled for the last alternative, at least for the Amiga 1200, because in my opinion, being able to use parallax effects and movement in the background is critical to recreate that arcade feeling of a game like Street Fighter II. And the color limitation, well, we need to come back to that. So basically, we are stuck with 16 colors per background layer, and the sprite capabilities that can't physically fit 2 characters into the sprite hardware. So I guess we're off to a good start, right? But this is where the custom chips of the Amiga come in handy. The Amiga had 3 major chips: Agnes, Denise, and Paula. Agnes had 2 components that were very useful to the Amiga. First, the blitter, which allowed for displaying and redrawing sprite-like objects on screen called blitter objects. Bobs for short. It functions like normal 16x16 sprites and actually has no real theoretical restrictions of how many objects can be drawn on screen at once, or at which size, except blitter speed itself and direct memory access. Secondly, we have the coprocessor, also known as the copper. This part of the Agnes is synchronized with the Amiga video output and will allow for instructions to be triggered whenever the beam of a CRT triggers a certain line or a certain position of a line. And this is used extensively in Amiga games, something that will become more apparent as we progress through this demo. Another part of the Amiga architecture was the Paula chip, which handled both I/O operations as well as the sound of the hardware. The audio capabilities of the Amiga was amazing, and it distinguished itself quite heavily from home computers as well as video game hardware of its time. The reason for this was that the Amiga didn't really rely on FM synthesis or general MIDI. It had 4 channels of PCM audio and could really play and modulate any audio sample you threw at it. For me personally, this is really what made the Amiga special, since it offered musicians and composers the freedom to create whatever sound or music they wanted. When the architecture debuted in 1987, there was really nothing like it. For IBM-compatible PCs, FM synthesizers and MIDI cards were the only way to go. And the cheap Adlib sound card cost around half of the total cost of an Amiga 500. Many people who owned IBM compatibles stuck with the built-in PC speaker instead. I cannot stress enough the importance of the Paula chip for the Amiga, especially for game soundtracks. Although I lack the talent to create my own soundtrack for this curious demo of Street Fighter II, I can just imagine what it could sound like if it was given to the right talent. The only real limitation of the Amiga audio hardware was the 4 channels. Something that could actually be remedied through smart composing with interrupts or audio channel mixing utilizing the CPU of the Amiga, allowing for more channels at the expense of a slight reduction in audio quality, with this last alternative being more viable on the Amiga 1200 due to the faster CPU performance. And lastly, we have the Denise and Lisa chip, depending on which platform you're on. It is often referred to as the display enabler, and it handles the different display modes together with the copper chip. We have gone through this previously in the comparison between the Amiga 500 and Amiga 1200, whereas the Lisa chip is the only true 32-bit chip in the Amiga 1200. I won't cover this in more detail since I think it's time for us to crack on with the Street Fighter II demo. After looking at the custom chips of the Amiga, we realized that the first specification of only having 1 character on screen was in fact incorrect. The blitter would allow us to be freed from the limitations of the sprite hardware, and instead we can use large blitter objects for our main characters. And in extension, we have untapped sprite hardware at our disposal, and we also learned that we have great audio capabilities, far exceeding the sound capability of the arcade board. Because of this, things are starting to look a lot brighter, but we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the resolution. The Capcom Arcade hardware used non-square pixels and a resolution of 384 x 224. And although the Amiga has the ability to exceed this, there's really no perfect match or realistic match in terms of creating an arcade game. And considering the arcade being a 60Hz game, I think the low resolution NTSC mode is the best fit for the Amiga. However, since the horizontal resolution is 83.33% of the arcade, I would rather go all the way down to 288 pixels width. This would allow for a lot more time for the blitter to draw on screen, and instead we are losing 25% pixel horizontally, which works much better for downscaling graphics. And I'm thinking of maintaining the pixel density vertically while cropping the playfield 12 pixels on the top and 12 pixels on the bottom of the screen instead. And well, although 288 x 200 pixels seems like a compromise, it's still much better than the Super Nintendo's 256 x 192 pixels. 75% horizontal downscale is actually quite easy to work with, and with some pixel art cleanup, we can actually make the graphics look very similar to the arcade, especially if we use the same aspect ratio. And really, in comparison to the 16-bit conversions, it's not even a battle, the Amiga surpasses them by a long shot. However, since there has been so many changes in the demo over time, I will need to downscale, redraw and curate everything from scratch once the technical blueprint is settled. It does look a bit wonky right now and the dithering isn't correct, so next time around I will probably avoid dithering as much as I can and instead go the route of curating colors and palettes and make better use of the hardware, which would result in a lot of improvements, like the higher number of perceived colors, as well as adding back animated elements like the cheering audience in the background. Which really takes us to the next step. Colors. 16 colors, 2 layers. How the heck is this enough? Just taking a random screenshot of Street Fighter II Arcade version, you end up with more than 256 colors. And this is really when the fun technical graphics puzzles start. How can we construct a scene effectively on the Amiga? So let's start with a blank slate. Then we can add a background color. We could just add the sky color, but if we look at the scene of Ken's stage, it's easy to spot that there are 3 very distinct horizontal lines crossing the scene, and since the Amiga has the copper, we can create a copper list which issues commands while the Amiga is drawing the scene line by line. We could tell the copper to swap colors when it reaches a certain point on screen, resulting in something like this. But we could also ask it to continue swapping through colors on every line as it crosses the screen, creating this nice gradient. With this strategy, we have almost gotten 200 colors already, but in actuality, we are only using 1 color from the palette, while the coprocessor is doing the rest. After the background color, let's continue with the sprites. Since we could use blitter objects for characters, we have the full set of hardware sprites at our disposal for the background objects. So let's start off with the cloud sprite. It's actually a 128 pixel wide 16 color sprite from the arcade. So basically we are already using up half of the hardware sprite capabilities already. The copper can then multiplex this sprite without additional cost, which is nice because it fills the whole screen. And then we could add the next cloud sprite and multiplex that one as well. And yeah, now we're just running out of sprites. But remember how I said that the copper can issue commands on basically any part of the screen? Well, so can it with regards to sprites. So basically, since the clouds do not cross path with each other, we can just use the copper to load sprites, display them during a certain amount of lines, and then remove them from memory, freeing up the sprite slots as we go across the screen. And same goes for the ocean. I went the route of making 2 colors transparent to let the nice background gradient shine through, and instead of having one big static image like the arcade, I divided the ocean to several sprites, multiplexing them with the benefit of being able to scroll each of them individually for a nice parallax scrolling effect. While I was at it, I realized that the character shadows, as well as the shoreline, could use sprites as well, Well, the shoreline is positioned a bit different from the arcade. The idea was not to cross path with the lines of the clouds. That way I would only use half of the sprites, and the rest could be used for miscellaneous things like fireballs, hit markers, knockout stars, etc. When it comes to playfield number 1, we are using the blitter to create the boat, and it is placed in a manner to cover the funny transition between the coastline and the cloud sprite, and it works quite well. Although it isn't arcade accurate, it is a compromise I am willing to make to get more out of this graphical demo. So far, everything fit into the specifications of 16 color per individual sprite, and 16 color for the first playfield. However, the boat used up all of the colors of the first playfield, but we still need to make the secondary boat, as well as the ground, and, well, they can't really make use of a single 16 color palette. And since playfield number 2 will be exclusive to 2 characters and the UI elements, we need to figure out something else. And yeah, the next boat is a big one, with a cheering crowd and the total number of 80 colors. Yeah, that's a rough one. If we let it use the same colors as the other boat, well, it gets a bit rough around the edges. But what if we told the copper to change the palette both horizontally and vertically? Yeah, well, with a slight adjustment to the boat's placing, they do not intersect with one another, and the copper has enough time to do the palette change whenever it reaches a certain point on screen. However, reducing 80 colors to 16 colors on the second boat doesn't really cut it. So I think we need to exploit the copper ship even more heavily. Sure, this is a headache to implement in the copper list, but if we were to divide the boat into different sections and swap colors as we pass by, we can actually retain most or even all the colors depending on how detailed we want to go with the copper list. And the thing is, the arcade hardware also uses color swaps in its own way. I have no experience working with the CPS-1 hardware, but looking at the dip switch settings, we find that backgrounds are actually based on 16x16 blocks with 16 color palettes assigned to those blocks. And up until now, this is why I haven't had the cheering crowd in the boat, because I was trying to target 16 colors, and it was extremely hard to do so with people on the boat wearing different outfits with different colors. And well, then I shrunk the graphics to 25% and everything started to look kind of messy. However, I have been talking to Neoman from Titan Art Collective, a far more experienced Amiga programmer, and he thinks that it's perfectly feasible, although a bit of a headache, to map up all of these color swaps. And then lastly, we have the ground. I wish I could have used those gradients in the background, but since the arcade hardware is using 16 colors for the ground, I kind of cheaped out and just left it the way it was, and at least it's arcade perfect, right? Now, when we are finished with playfield number 1, we can actually focus on animation. We want the boat or the boats to move up and down like the arcade, but moving all of these 16x16 blitter objects up and down, it requires actually quite a lot from the rendering budget. But what would happen if we, well, you guessed it, use the copper to move the whole playfield vertically? This is actually possible, and we can stop the movement at the line where the ground starts, almost making the boats look like they are on a separate playfield from the ground. For the ground, we can increase the horizontal movement on every line as we scroll the game, creating the same kind of nice 3D effect as in the arcade. And up until this point, we actually don't use the blitter at all for rendering. With other words, the blitter has full focus on the 2 characters, actually making this hypothetical version very feasible for 60 FPS arcade gameplay. And lastly, we have playfield number 2, which includes the UI, characters, and the bollards. And since these never really intersect and the characters will travel behind the UI, the color swaps required for another 3 palettes is not really an issue. Well, up until now, except resolution, I think the hypothetical Amiga 1200 version has done an amazing job at actually surpassing the arcade in some aspects. However, there is a big, and I mean a really big compromise that will require a lot of time from the artist, and that is the characters. They need to be downscaled, they need to be touched up, and well, instead of having 16 colors each, they need to share a 16 color palette. At first, I was terrified at this realization, but I did a test just for fun, using my own palette which I've been trying out for KK's upcoming Doom game, Dread. And I realized that as long as you are very conscious with RGB coverage and have good ramps, you can actually make Street Fighter II characters almost use all of the colors and not really miss out on any detail. Keep in mind, this palette was not created for Street Fighter II specifically, but rather the colors had been handpicked cautiously while nerding endlessly over color theory. And the thing was, my curiosity took the best of me, so I didn't just do one character, I did a lot of characters, and they actually turned out surprisingly well. And I have been discussing this with Neoman of what we could do, and we have been thinking about actually making a dynamic palette depending on which characters are chosen for a certain stage. So yeah, we could probably improve this a lot, but this showcased just that you can do a lot from just having 16 colors and using them on all characters, as long as the palette is very flexible. And this transitioned me into the last part of the video, my technical curiosity. Has it been cured, or has it calmed down? Well, I think it has in a way, and the reason for this is that I know for sure that an Amiga 1200 version of Street Fighter II would have been the best home conversion out there if it was given to the right developers with the right support from Capcom. If you stuck around until the end, let me know what you thought about the video. Did you learn something new? And what were your experiences of Street Fighter II? Did you play it back in the days? Heck, did you play a bad conversion of it? Or were you fortunate enough to relish in the 16-bit home conversions made by Capcom? Well, thank you so much for watching. If you find game dev content like this interesting, please consider subscribing. And hopefully, I'll catch you all in the next one.